So I've been studying Amazon now for about 5, 6 years, and the way that I studied Amazon was by taking a job. So I've worked in Amazon warehouses both outside Minneapolis and outside here in Seattle, in Kent. I worked in a fulfillment center and a sortation center, but I've also been actively engaged for the last about 2.5 years with comrades here in the city, with various left organizations, emerging tech working coalition, or the Emerging Tech Workers Coalition, and other activist-based groups that have been really on the ground trying to build power and trying to change the landscape, the political landscape around Amazon and its impacts here in the city. So if you think about capitalism and its impact of like the urban form, capitalism largely is a process of capital investment. If you're a capitalist, you invest into the urban landscape as a means of producing commodities. The main ways in which you do that is you take your money and you invest into factories, you invest into roads, you invest into marketplaces. The landscape itself is a space where you park your money as a way of then producing commodities that you can then earn a profit on. For a capitalist, largely, the relationship to the built environment is seen as value. It valorizes the landscape as a means of producing money in the long term. For capitalists, this produces a particularly interesting situation. Once you invest in production, so you're building a factory or you're building a headquarters, you're invested into that place for a longer period of time. So you're going to be long, if you think about it in terms of a business cycle, it's 20, 30, 40 years of trying to sustain as much time as possible the relationships to be able to produce value in that in that place. So capital inherently invests into place in a particular way. Workers, on the other hand, have a different relationship to place. And a lot of this is talked about now in terms of social reproduction or social reproduction theory. Workers, have to go to work because we have to sell our labor power and able to buy the things that we need to live. We need to be able to buy our houses, we need to be able to buy food, we need to be able to buy our gym memberships or our beers or bicycles. But for workers, the city isn't experienced or seen really as a relationship to commodity production or as a space of producing value, but rather as a means of reproducing ourselves. And that question is actually a much deeper question rather than like reproducing ourselves and buying stuff. It's where we find our own senses of value. It's where we realize who we are, right? In our cities, we produce art, we produce science and knowledge, we exercise and find ways of connecting with our body. We go out into the natural environment, into parks, and connect with the space around us. We connect with each other in terms of communities. We have places of worship. We have this entire social relationship to space that's very different than the commodity production space. It's a way in which we become people. It's how we realize ourselves and have our own sense of self-valorization. So workers are always existing in this relationship where they, A, depend on capital for the jobs, they depend on that investment, but also they're trying to produce space in their own way for their own self-actualization, for our own communities, for ourselves. It's largely a project of commitment to making sure that the space that is around us sustains human life, right? Like that's how most people relate to our cities. Our cities are these spaces that is, that's about us. It's about our own self-valorization. And so when we think about kind of working class social reproduction, there's this tension that exists between the capitalist class that's really investing money as a means of producing and maintaining the social relationships of commodity production, and kind of the working class that wants to, as much as possible, shape the urban environment for their own needs. And there's tension that exists in that relationship. Right? So if you're thinking about a city, if we're thinking about the kind of housing that we want housing that's safe, that's affordable, that's dense, that allows us to actually live in the places that we want to live. If we're queer, we want to be able to live in a community that supports that, like Capitol Hill. If we're black, or if we have different church-based relationships, we want to be able to live in spaces that are around, that are our choice. Capitalists have a different relationship to housing, right? They want to see and be able to realize profit from those spaces. And sometimes that works in conjunction and works well. A lot of the times it doesn't. Right? Also, if you want to think about a park and you have a housing development, you have a bunch of workers that would prefer to have a park or a social space where they could go and connect with nature, exercise, play sports. For a capitalist, that could be space that they must have to maximize to be able to earn a profit on that land. So they're forced, in a sense, to want to develop that space, right? If we think about a forest exists as a capitalist as something to be exploited, to turn into value, turn into commodities, or a city can be exploited to turn into housing that produces investment. But workers have a different relationship. They want to produce it in a way that they have the right to their own self-fulfillment and their own self-realization. And what this essentially leads to is a crisis over controlling investment, over controlling social wealth, right? So workers produce all this wealth, And capitalists are able to capture it through the commodity production process. But what we're fighting over is the democratic control over the wealth that we all have. And that includes the ability to invest and control investment processes, the ability to say that we want taxes to go to our schools, we want our taxes to be able to provide childcare, we want the wealth that we produce to be able to be democratically decided upon about how we want to get around the city, if we want to invest into mass transit or not, right? We want to put those into spaces where there's more democratic control to produce the city we want, whereas capitalists are trying to control that money as much as possible to produce the city they want. A lot of times that city is, how do I make more money from this particular space? What are my interests in maintaining this dynamic where we have kind of control over the power of investment? And so there's this really intense actual class struggle that exists over producing the city in a way that either meets human needs or produces profit. So that's kind of the broad theoretical structure in which I like to think about the ways in which the urban form is shaped. And if we think about this as a particular class struggle, right, we have to think about the working class and how the working class in particular has been able to organize itself to form its own composed self, to be able to operate politically for itself, a class for itself. And then the working class in general has been able to organize very successfully and very powerfully. It's able to actually control and organize space in a way that uses it for its own needs rather than for capital's needs. So it depends on the ability to actually have a political working class that operates as a working class that has a kind of unified vision of what it wants to do. Amazon.com is a particularly interesting company to look at. Amazon is important because it's a large tech monopoly company. It's one of the largest corporations in the world. It's now the second largest employer in the United States after Walmart. But it also kind of embodies, in a sense, this new technical division of labor in our society. On one hand, you have Seattle in HQ, the headquarters, right? So you have this group of really talented engineers, designers, UX designers, salespeople, kind of the skilled, higher paid levels of the working class that still exist as workers. And then on the other hand of Amazon, you have logistics workers. So that's, there's 360 fulfillment centers, or 360 warehouses in the United States. So these warehouses are paid, $13 to $15, or now $15 an hour. A couple years ago, it was about $13 an hour. And these warehouses are low-paid work. They're kind of the factory form of retail. It's really intense and brutal work, but also part of this kind of area where wages haven't grown at all, whereas tech worker wages have grown up a lot, right? So if we think about Amazon, we actually get to this kind of big separation that's happened in the working class in a long time between skilled tech workers and kind of de-skilled, lower wage work. And it's worth talking about a little history, actually, about this process. So there's a little story. In the 1940s, when early Silicon Valley got started, there was this company called Halcyon Semiconductors, and they came out of the radio producing industry. They left the East Coast because they were really fed up with the stuck-up corporate environment of the East Coast, the bureaucratic systems, the connections between business and government. But when they came out here and they actually started in Silicon Valley and producing both radio tubes and early semiconductors, they were actually radical socialists, which is kind of weird. When they early started the first company, they were, one, scared of unionization because they didn't want to cede control of the shop floor of producing these new things. But in the most part, they wanted to produce a space where workers would work in harmony with the natural environment, where workers would own the means of production, where workers would have a stake in the company. So they started actually forming these kind of cooperatives. And the way that they formed these cooperatives, interestingly enough, was through stock options. So they gave all workers at the company these stock options, and stock options essentially invested them into the company. What was really interesting is during this time, they had a huge amount of money from the military, so it wasn't a very competitive marketplace. But by the 1970s, you had this company called Fairchild. Fairchild was actually a product of both Varian and Halcyon Semiconductors. You can look at a map of Silicon Valley companies, and it all kind of comes back to Fairchild. Fairchild in the 1970s were manufacturing semiconductors in a really industrial way. And they were still trying to stick to this idea that everyone, including lower wage workers, including everyone that works on their suburban campus in Silicon Valley, were part of a larger family, part of a corporatist organization where everyone's producing together. But all of a sudden, you had this union drive coming from San Francisco that dropped all the way down to the industrial area where they were manufacturing these semiconductors. Not wanting to actually cede the shop floor sheet production to the union, lose the political control over that relationship, but Fairchild actually did is that they separated the manufacturing of semiconductors from the engineering work. They took this manufacturing work, shipped it first to Maine, Portland, Maine, but eventually over to Taiwan, and actually started the first of the investment into Hong Kong and Southeast Asia of semiconductor manufacturing. People that were doing the assembly work when it came back over, all of a sudden were subcontracted out. They weren't given the same benefits, they weren't given the same stock options, they weren't allowed to participate in the daily operation of the company. Engineers were. Engineers were still given these same benefits. They were placed in a space where not only were they part of this growing industry, they were kind of involved in almost a cooperative form of organization, but also interestingly, they were starting to produce all these new technical tools that were radically changing the world. They thought that they were producing, new history that could actually be changing the world for the better, right? So we start to get this ideology that comes out, that the technology that we're producing is making the world a better place. And the engineers that are in that space, that are producing in these Silicon Valley headquarters that were largely in these suburban areas, were enrolled in that process in an ongoing way. So if we think about this, like following this trajectory down to Google, which has the phrase, do no evil, to Amazon, which actually thinks it's making the world a better place, right? For a small set of workers, largely these engineers, they're involved in that process in a very different way than those manufacturer workers that were shipped overseas to the jobs that were displaced there, or the jobs that were subcontracted out. So you had this huge separation that by the 1980s comes to define actually the major social relationships of work in our country, where you have really highly skilled work in these tech campuses that are largely in the suburbs, and this low-wage work that's been subcontracted out, that's essentially non-union, that's been kind of broken out from the main engineering work. And you have this big divide that starts to take place, right? And what was interesting with the suburbs and the Silicon Valley companies is that they built these headquarters out in the suburbs because they wanted to make it look like these really rural, scholastic-looking spaces that felt like a campus environment. And this happened across the United States. All of a sudden, corporate campuses that had engineers and skilled workers were largely building out in the suburbs where they had predominantly white male workforce and had workers that lived out in the suburbs. And in the cities where the manufacturing work used to be, you had deindustrialization, you had loss of jobs, you had kind of working class that was still largely confined in urban environments. What's been really interesting about Amazon is that we've started to see this flip in a radical way, and Amazon has been at the center of this process. So Amazon, if you think about it, is actually deeply a suburban company. So the 360 fulfillment, sortation, and delivery centers that Amazon has are largely located outside major cities. Prior to 2001, Amazon, if you can see here, used to be in kind of these center distribution hubs where you could get to the majority of places as fast as possible. They located there because they didn't have to pay taxes on anything that was done online. But in 2012, they made this change in strategy where they wanted to deliver as much as possible items in 2 days to kind of a growing urban millennial class that had both the extra money to be able to buy commodities, as well as the density of routes to be able to deliver things to people. So they had to be close enough to cities to actually deliver these things in. Since 2012, they've had an aggressive capital expansion program where they've invested in these suburban communities to build these massive warehouses that employ 2,000 people. So outside now, every single major US city in these suburban communities, you have these massive complexes of what are essentially the new retail factories, right? These fulfillment centers that have really grueling conditions. And across the United States, not only is it Amazon, but it now increasingly a bunch of light manufacturing, other warehousing work, other e-commerce work is moving out to these suburban locations. So if we think of a place, it's hard to see on this map, but Chicago, you have downtown Chicago here. When Amazon builds its suite of fulfillment centers, it builds it around the city. And by building it around the city, they essentially locate in one area. They have a 30-minute access to the labor market around that particular fulfillment center. And these places have huge churn, right? So like the turnover is 104% a year in a fulfillment center. So if you start there, the chance that you're working with someone that you started with is almost none. So they're churning through these labor markets really fast. And if you think about looking down here in South Kent County, the warehouses aren't located in Seattle, but they're located in Kent, right? So there's about 6,000 to 8,000 fulfillment center workers located in Kent, in Puyallup, and kind of spread out through the South Kent County region. And because they're there, they're able to get commodities to us in one day. We're able to order something online. It goes through this crazy algorithmic process. They're able to ship it out in their 24-hour process to be able to get it to your doorstep. But a lot of that is now happening out in these suburban locations. What's been happening, though, with the suburbs across the United States is actually that the suburbs are now home to more poor people than cities. They call it the suburbanization of poverty. There's been this radical change where people displaced from cities, but also just looking for naturally affordable housing, have largely moved out of urban environments and have been moving into the suburbs. So not only is the rate increase of poor people within suburbs highest, now there's the absolute value of quote unquote poor folks who are living out in the suburbs. The suburbs are also this crazy new space, right, where you have this kind of new layer of people that are moving out to suburban environments. And the landscape out there is relatively understudied or like not really well understood. So suburban communities, if you're thinking about this, right? So if you paint a picture, I can paint a picture of one of my coworkers. So one of my coworkers used to live in this building. So this is Alturas and Burien. Alturas apartments were bought in, I think it was 2014 by this company called Fowler Property Services. Fowler, since 2012, since the financial crisis, has been doing this large capital investment program where they buy suburban housing complexes like this one. This one has 590 units. It used to be predominantly black or communities of color within that location. And what Fowler does when they go and they buy a property in the suburbs is they buy one of the largest properties, they put it on a fresh coat of paint, and they treat it as an investment, right? So within 2 years, they took the rent that was at $750 in 2013, bought the property, jumped the rent up to $1,400. When it got jumped up to $1,400, and all of a sudden you have one of the largest properties in the area, the market rents go up, right? So Fowler sold this last year for double what they bought it for. It gets, tons of big news in the investment community. And you look at Fowler Property Investments, across the United States, they've had a suburban strategy. And so since rental complexes in cities have largely lost their rate of return, are no longer profitable for kind of real estate investment trusts that do this work, the suburbs have now become this space where capital's flooding into and buying these formerly mom and pop or smaller apartment complexes and buying them up, doing this exact process of treating them as investments over time. So when we think about suburban housing, and we think about this, my coworker of mine that lived in Alturas, we tend to think of the suburbs as being really cheap. The crazy thing is that Kent actually has the 6th fastest raising rent in the country. And if you go to get an apartment in Kent, an average 1-bedroom still costs about $1,350, right? So these are places that capital has really moved into. You go into like these smaller apartment complexes and they're buying these up and transforming them into essentially capital investments. They're producing huge returns. So investors are piling into these locations. And what's really interesting about my coworker is that she, like many people now around her, are renters. So the biggest growth of renters in the country is now in the suburbs. So I think 1 out of every 3 new renters is now renting in suburban communities. So she lived in Alturas apartments, and when they bumped the rent up, she actually ended up moving in with her whole family with another family. And suburban poverty kind of tends to look really different, right? If we think about suburban poverty, we drive out towards Burien or towards Kent, we actually have this kind of post-1950s small apartment complexes or houses, but you look in the driveways of these houses that look a little bit, worse for wear, and all of a sudden you see 6, 7 cars in a driveway. And when you start door knocking on doors or talking to people or meeting people, you realize there's 2, 3 families living in each one of these houses, right? So there's just incredible density within these houses as people are moving in together. So my coworker ended up moving back in with her family, with her whole family, back into a shared house. But when she wants to try to go to work, suburban transit is a disaster, right? Our entire transit system, if we think about transit, right, is largely based radially to go from the suburbs to the city. It's about how to commute people into where we think of like these large job centers are. The ability to actually go from Burien to Kent or suburb to suburb on public transit is a disaster. There's 2 lines, barely. They don't run in the hours that you're probably going to work. If you are doing it, you're taking... So I have a coworker that worked West Seattle and would come to work. It was a 2.5-hour bus ride with 3 transfers to be able to get to work for a 4-hour shift. So that's not uncommon, right? For something that would be a 20-minute drive, the amount of transfers that it requires to actually get to work, it takes about 2 hours to get there by public transit. So what it actually ends up leading to is increased car dependence. But cars function in a kind of interesting way, right? Cars both are a space for people to experience freedom, to actually have mobility. But when you're sitting there and your pay's not very good and your rent's really high, cars actually become a kind of burden. You're looking at that gas tax, right? Or you're looking at that gas tab every week, and the $55, that adds up, right? So if we think about like what actually happened in France with the yellow vest, that was over a gas tax, right? So that gas tax comes in, and you look at that gas price every single day, and that all of a sudden comes up, that will piss you off. It was really funny to me that most of my coworkers actually talked about the Yellow Vest Rebellion far more in the suburbs than I actually heard people or socialists even talking about it in the city center. If we think about this, right, the Yellow Vest started out in a suburban community. It started out in the banlieues or in the suburban areas of working class poverty in Europe. So you have this increased car dependence, and there's a whole set of loan situations that's happening around cars that's pretty predatory as well. But cars all of a sudden become a necessity for your day-to-day life rather than something that is just a point of freedom, right? You become enslaved to the car or the automobile. In general, too, right? If where she's sending her kids to school. In Kent produces, I think, 1/6 of the state's total GDP, yet schools are radically underfunded, right? Just like all of our schools, they're criminally underfunded in this state. But in suburban areas, and particularly these working class communities, you don't have the same tax rates that have largely supported these public schools. And Kent teachers haven't been on strike just this last year. They've been on strike since 2011, right? Like you look back on every single year, they're fighting these contracts to be able to actually change their student to teacher ratio, be able to actually afford to live in the suburbs, which are now incredibly expensive places. So schools are actually radically underfunded. And what's particularly happening in these areas is not only do you have the suburbanization of poverty happening, it's super racialized, right? So you have historically, and particularly these white working class, or these communities, you have like the fabled quote unquote white working class. So you have these white flight communities that in the 1950s through 1970s largely left the city. We're buying houses in these areas, right? We're not talking about the white flight that goes out to the east side. We're not talking about the white flight that goes out to the wealthy suburbs. You have these areas that are largely homeowners of white flight communities that left in the 1950s to the 1970s. But people that are coming out to the suburbs now are largely people of color and immigrants, right? Immigrants don't move into the city anymore when they're moving into a new location. They're actually moving into suburban and exurban locations. So you have this really strange dynamic where you have kind of this white working class community that tends to have higher levels of home ownership, although there's huge amounts of dispossession during the 2008 financial crisis, on top of this new layer of people coming out that are largely people of color, that are largely immigrant. And the consequences of that are actually pretty severe, right? If we look about what's happening in Burien politically, Burien was the first place in the United States that the Freedom Foundation invested in to repeal sanctuary city status. This was a very calculated move because if you look at Burien politics and the 4 people that were running for city office, you had 4 labor candidates and 4 totally right-wing candidates that were running on the platform of Keep Burien. What was the platform, Boris?
Burien first.
Yeah, Burien first. So the entire aspect of this political landscape, they invested in this area to try to actually move the suburban community towards kind of the far right. What ended up happening is that the labor candidates won, but they won by like 1 or 2 percentage points. It was a very close election. But in South King County and across suburbs as well, in particular here in South King County, you've also seen an increase in hate crimes. So hate crimes have doubled in the last 4 years, and largely that's located out in these suburban communities. So there's this kind of intense racialized politics that exists in these locations. And so the politics, and largely if you're thinking about these Amazon fulfillment centers, right? This landscape is actually the perfect environment for capital accumulation, right? So you have workers that are increasingly desperate to make rent payments. They're in an environment where they can barely afford rent. They're struggling to make their car payments. They're having to work a lot to be able to do that. You have Amazon that's all starting flexible shifts where a lot of their work is part-time. You have people that are required to go into work essentially to come in there and forced to take in really bad conditions. Amazon pays health insurance, so it's better than working for McDonald's or working for Taco Bell. So you're stuck in this situation where capital has essentially produced an amazing environment for its own exploitation. It pays 0 taxes in these locations, right? So when Amazon actually came and they invested all this the money into these fulfillment centers, they've been not just not paying taxes, they've gone over, I think, I forget what the number was, it's like $2.2 billion across the United States now in tax subsidies for building these fulfillment centers. So not only are they not paying taxes back into these communities, they've actually been extracting money from these communities. So extracting money that fits into how we invest in housing, how we invest in schools, how we invest in transit. So it produces this environment that not only does it serve capital's own ability to exploit workers, to be able to actually push them to harder levels without expecting pushback, or to be able to expand these part-time shifts where a lot of my coworkers are not just working one job, they're working one full-time job, two part-time jobs to be able to get by. If you're a mom, you take your kids to school, you work a part-time shift at Amazon, you go pick up your kids at school. So you have this kind of relationship where it's actually a perfect environment for capitalist exploitation. But the actual environment in terms of what it's like for workers is pretty bad, right? If we want to think about this community as a space where we actually have the ability to realize ourselves, we're working harder than ever. We're working in situations, living in environments where we don't feel safe. We can't move out of home if you're under the age of 40. If you're queer, which I had a coworker who was gay but was living in a conservative house but couldn't move out, so you had to deal with his dad's own homophobia. If we had a coworker who was a woman experiencing domestic abuse and couldn't move out of the relationship, or find a new apartment because she couldn't actually afford the down payment on a new house, right? If we want to think about the ability to actually realize ourselves and live in a thriving community, like this is capital's like full domination over these communities. And it's no surprise that when you see the politics of the suburbs, that you actually have a politics that's deeply rooted in resentment. And resentment is a kind of politics that comes out largely from depression, anxiety, isolation, alienation, right? You have communities that have been largely disrupted, that have been moving out to the suburbs, that no longer have the strong foundational ties and relationships that make communities worth living in, right? So you have these communities that have been kind of torn apart and still yet haven't really been pulled back together again. And that's not always the case, right? There's a lot of exceptions to that rule, whether you have strong immigrant communities like the Sikh community here in South King County that have really deep ethnic and social solidarity ties. That's kind of rooted within the community. But if you're not in kind of a deeper network of solidarity to actually be able to support yourself, support your family, it's actually really a bleak landscape. And I laugh poorly there, but it produces, in a sense, a kind of systemic trauma, right? An ability where we're not actually able to realize ourselves in any really meaningful way. We can't participate meaningfully in our workspaces. We can't participate meaningfully in the direction our society is moving in. So what it ends up leading to is a lot of hate, a lot of resentment for the world that's around you, a lot of misplaced resentment in terms of racism or xenophobia, in terms of blaming other people. You see this not just amongst kind of white working class people with other immigrants or POC communities, but also within those communities. And you have a space that's largely like people looking out for themselves, and that's a hard politics to organize in. It's a hard politics to actually have the conditions for solidarity, the conditions to actually move towards something that's better. So if we think about this in terms of class composition, what we've seen in suburban communities and kind of the suburbanization of poverty in the United States, what it actually kind of looks like is like the decomposition of the working class. It's the working class that's actually been torn apart and torn asunder by the forces of capital. Yet when we flip to Amazon and start going to the high-tech side, it's a completely different and also kind of crazy situation, right? So if we're thinking back to this kind of separation that happened between engineering work and lower paid work that happened largely in the tech sector in California, you have essentially this new arrangement that's happening within cities. And in fact, Amazon, we have to thank for this large trend that's happening. So in 2013, Bezos wrote this to a letter to shareholders. It's the fact that we could have saved money by instead building in the suburbs, but for us, it was important to stay in the city. Many of our employees can live nearby, skip the commute altogether, and walk to work. Though I can't prove it, I also believe an urban headquarters will keep Amazon vibrant, attract the right talent, and be great for the health and well-being of our employees in the city of Seattle. So Amazon actually is one of the first corporations, right? If we think of urban tech campuses, right? We think of Redmond, we think of Cupertino, we think of Mountain View, right? We think of these suburban locations that are largely outside of cities. Amazon was one of the first corporations to put its headquarters back in the urban core. And it did this, historically since, I think, like the early 2000s when it was originally on Beacon Hill and then moved down and, took control of Vulcan Properties and has been building its own, very isolated bubble campus in South Lake Union. But this trend is now happening across the United States, right? So increasingly, these campuses that used to be in the suburbs are increasingly now moving into downtown urban cores. If we think about it here In Seattle, it's not just, right, these tech companies that are doing it, but Weyerhaeuser, which is a logging company. They had this beautiful campus that's out in Federal Way. It's a beautiful piece of modernist, brutalist infrastructure. It's stunning. But they closed that campus down and moved into the city. They're doing that largely because they're trying to recruit talent, right? When it comes to recruiting talent, they're looking for young millennial workers that are now entering the workforce that might have grown up in the suburbs but no longer want to live in suburban locations and are trying to move into the city. So in trying to acquire this talent, they're putting themselves in these urban locations, and it's kind of justified under this rhetoric that it makes people more creative, it makes them happier, which to a certain extent it does, right? If you actually have the money and ability to live in the city, to live in a way that you want to live, you actually are more productive and a happier, happier worker, and also probably going to be more creative in the work that you do. But if we think about it too, right, the bubble couldn't be a more perfect illustration of how this is actually developed, right? Amazon has these spheres that are located on its urban campus, and you can't go visit the spheres if you're a member of a public, right? You can only go on a certain visitation day, but you have to actually have your blue badge to be able to scan in to go into the spheres. The spheres are designed as the space for tech workers to have reflection, to be able to ponder the meaning of the universe and the algorithms that they're writing, right? And so it's this space that's completely isolated from the rest of the city. You expand that out to the campus itself, right? You go to South Lake Union, and you have private security guards that are keeping unhoused people off the street. You have an area that's been sanitized and maintained as a perfect space of commodity consumption that's been cultured for a very small percentage of our population, right? And wants to keep out the rest actually in a very real way of separating space for the core people that are allowed within this tech campus life and kind of the outside world that's happening within the city. But these are filled with contradictions, right? So if we think about tech capital in particular, we have money that's being produced everywhere in the world, and so much of it is now concentrating in these areas like San Francisco, Seattle, New York, Austin. You have money that's flown, right? If you think about Uber, for every single driver that's driving one Uber ride, you have 70 cents of that dollar that goes to the Uber driver, however much it is now, and 30 cents that goes back to San Francisco. And that happens not just from a driver that's in San Francisco, but a driver that's happening in, Mumbai. So if you have this huge amount of market power that these tech companies have, right, you have this huge amount of capital that's now concentrating in these major cities. When it concentrates in these cities and you have a bunch of tech workers that actually have, for this small amount of time, the ability to bargain salaries because they're scarce, they actually have the market power to bargain salaries. They get wages that are astronomical, right? Like the wages that tech workers earn now is a historical anomaly that only emerges in a world of tech monopoly capital, that only exists in a world where the skills that they have are really scarce, that only exists in the space where they're actually concentrated in these urban markets, right? So all of a sudden you have these cities that on one hand are attracting tons of capital and paying for a small section of people. They're able to afford elements to the city. But all of a sudden, on top of that, you have a whole range of problems that emerge. So you have this capital that's flooding into these locations, a small amount of people that are competing for a scarce amount of houses that drive houses up, a whole political environment that's completely incapable of adjusting to this changing transformation. You get gridlock traffic, you get displacement and gentrification in communities, things that we all know, right? So we get gentrification of communities like here in Cap Hill that used to be a predominantly queer LGBTQ community, and that's been kind of torn apart. You had the Central District that used to be the historically black community in Seattle, and that's been torn apart, right? It's kind of funny, they call Kent the Kentral District because everyone that used to live in Central now lives in Kent. But you have this issue, right, where if you're not earning that tech money in the city of Seattle, you're hurting. It's a hard place to live. And this is true in San Francisco, where you see increased rates of unhoused people, in Seattle, increased rates of unhoused people, but also people unable to actually live and afford to live in the city that they want, which produces these contradictions where all of a sudden you have this kind of growing frustration and anger within these cities as they experience these kind of real material contradictions. And all the ways that we also think about where anger comes from is that it's relative. When you see like everyone around you that's doing the same, it doesn't produce the same anger response. But when you see a handful of people doing really well and you're really not, it produces a very different emotional register. And so it's not surprising that we've actually seen a lot of conflict that's emerging in our cities, right? So Seattle is kind of fascinating that we do have this kind of small space or this amazing growth that's happening here, but that growth is very contained within kind of a very small set of people. And the political landscape is extremely challenging. Right? What's really interesting, too, is that the majority of the workers that are coming into these cities that are working these engineering jobs, that are working in sales or UX design, they're actually largely liberal. So the vast majority of tech workers, this compares to the 1980s, when if you were to go out to Redmond, or you were to go onto like a GE campus outside of New York, the vast majority of workers on those campuses were hardline Republicans, like libertarian, like Reagan-esque Republicans. But now all of a sudden that you have these kind of young millennials that are living within these cities, the vast majority of tech workers are actually very left on the spectrum. Like they're very liberal, they believe in social justice, they're college educated, they come out of the one place where Marxists have actually been for the last 30 years, which is the academy. And so they actually have a general kind of a left-leaning politics that wants to actually see an equitable world. They want to see equity in their communities, they want to see equity in terms of the racial composition and gender composition in their workforces. But they're deeply liberal in the way that they think about this, right? So a lot of the tech workers that I talk to in my interviews, what actually really matters for them in the work that they do is that they find meaningful work. They want work where they feel like they're making a difference in the world. And tech gives them this ideology, right? That like you're coming in, you're making the world a better place, you're driving the solutions the government can't to the issues, major issues that we have in our world. So they're actually coming into these spaces with the idea that like the jobs that they want to pursue can be meaningful. And the way that they actually change the system isn't by like changing the corporate system, but by voting for Hillary Clinton, voting for liberals that want to give the rhetoric that we're actually interested in these questions around equity, but we don't actually have the solutions or strategies to actually produce equity in a real meaningful way. So what's really interesting is that like, right, the city of Seattle is still deeply wedded to this liberal ideology, in particular neoliberal strategies for addressing problems, but you have this latent desire and like for people to thrive and for that to be extended out, right? Like all tech workers aren't sociopaths that want to see humans suffering. And they're confronted with this every single day, right? If you're commuting into work, you're confronted with the homelessness problem. You're confronted with the fact that you know that everyone in this warehouse is making the money that's paying your salary is being treated like shit. They know these things. They're like the ghosts that haunt their imagination. But the strategies in which they go about it are very strange, right? And it's not only, right, just this kind of rhetoric around want to make the world a better place, but the tools that they're building, right? The amount that we see in the kind of corporate media of like the ideas that the algorithms that they're building, that AI, that technology and automation was actually will save people time, will make the world better, that these algorithms can make our lives easier is true. Like they believe that this is what's happening. And want to be able to produce in that space. And so it's a really interesting political space to be working in. So it's a question sometimes I think of like how to make that change that's starting to switch. Yet if we also think of class composition, right, and we think the story that I told is kind of bleak, right? Like the story of both this kind of displacement and gentrification in cities that's now on turbo drive from this tech capitalism, as well as these suburban communities that are these spaces of disinvestment. Right? Both of these spaces are spaces that capital has largely controlled and organized for the last 40 years. They've been able to control investment. They've been able to control the money that they have. They're able to produce space in a way that essentially dominates the working class. And the working class in the United States has been thoroughly decomposed, right? And if you want to get down to like that decomposition, it comes down and manifests again in kind of these major crises that we see around mental health, around depression, anxiety, alienation, isolation, things that are just as real for tech workers, right? It's been commodified, largely the question around mental health. You know, you go and do your yoga and meditation and then, you know, go buy your apartment complex for your gentrifying community. But, right, those feelings are also really real. And you have this kind of situation where people are craving community, but don't really have it. And that's largely because the spaces have been completely dominated by capital in this very specific way. But what's also happened is the working class has been decomposed, is that the capitalist class is actually very fucking aware that they're the capitalist class and that they have their own interests. So in terms of corporations, when they're thinking about, especially these large tech companies, right? These large tech companies that now control huge amounts of wealth, they're interested in not just kind of producing and maintaining the relationships that they have for them to be entirely profitable, but now they have to kind of deal with this unrest a little bit. They have to deal with the fact that the cities are kind of falling apart, that there's displacement that's going on, that people can't afford to live where they are. So they try to come up with their own agenda. And there's a group that not too many people know about that's called Challenge Seattle. We normally think of like the Chamber of Commerce, right, as like the political arm of capital. It's the capitalist class that invests into the Chamber of Commerce. Chamber of Commerce comes to represent business, and it represents the interests of business or the capitalist class within the community. Challenge Seattle, it says, committed leaders, shared vision, greater good. So Challenge Seattle is a group that's largely Amazon funded, but it has Microsoft, Lyft, Starbucks, Boeing, essentially like all the large corporations. And they've come together and they're led by former governor, I can't remember her name, but former New Lib Dem, that's, you know, who?
Gregoire? Christine Gregoire?
Yeah. So she's kind of the face of the organization. And Challenge Seattle has now started to want to address the major problems by producing a shared vision for our city. And the shared vision that they have for the city is, not surprisingly, a great vision for them to continue making money. So on one hand, let me go back here. You have a transportation policy, and the transportation policy that Challenge Seattle is putting out is, hey, let's not build mass transportation, let's definitely not tax corporations to do that, but instead let's invest money into smart transit systems, and let's do kind of new pilot initiatives to test self-driving cars. Of course, there's a company here that has a major interest in driving self-driving cars, in particular the last mile of delivery, that it would be extremely good for the company in the long run to ability to have self-driver cars to deliver packages without workers. Very fantastic. So let's invest our money and invest the community's money. We're still not going to get taxed for it in programs to pilot self-driving cars. And if we pilot these programs as self-driving cars, of course, which our other large venture capitalists in the region, Madrona, have huge amounts of capital vested in, right? Madrona has a huge political interest in seeing self-driving cars being the future of our transportation crisis, the solution that we all invest in, because they have massive amounts of venture capital vested into it. All of a sudden you have this program where, yes, the transportation solution will be solved by automation and self-driving cars and a fully electrified transportation system that can be both green and get us around. Of course, yeah, subways, nothing, mass transit, nothing. Any of these kind of solutions that actually, we might want rather than have to jump into a self-driving car controlled by a corporation that will take all of our data and automate the, largest blue-collar job in the country. Not an issue. When it comes to housing, it's a similar thing, right? So the housing platform that they have is one that's being developed. There's some new protections for renters. They shouldn't be able to be kicked out so easily. Aren't we nice guys? We also, we're not going to give money for you to actually address the unhoused and homeless crisis. We'll invest our money into our own space. So they invested money into Mary's Place. They put it into one of their buildings in downtown Seattle. We'll take care of that issue ourselves. We don't think the government can handle it. They've been wasting all that money anyway. And so their housing solution is, sure, we'll do this and we'll let the private sector lead with a handful of NGOs that we know are responsible in addressing this issue. But we also need to solve their big issue. It's called the invisible crisis, which is the crisis in middle-income housing. It's not low-income housing, it's not affordable housing, it's middle-income housing because those teachers are moving out, which probably comes about from teachers being pissed off and unionizing and demanding fair pay to live in cities that they can't afford. But the visible crisis is seen as, okay, let's actually produce a space to allow investment into our city in a good way that allows housing to be built. But the strategy for doing that, as Microsoft has so nicely done, is to donate $475 million of Amazon surplus capital that they can't actually invest anywhere profitably and be like, here's a chunk of money to build housing with. Thank you, Microsoft. We've now taken your money to invest it happily into a private sector housing market that you get to now own a large part of our city. So the question isn't, no, let's not build mass transit and build public housing and reimagine our city. It's like, let's do these little piecemeal equations that largely serve our own interests and actually aren't interested in challenging the basic relationships of power in this city. And so this agenda that they're putting forward, right, extends not just to transportation, that's how to make money, housing, how to make them money, but also to education, right? So the day after the head tax and they had their big capital strike, they announced their new initiative around investing in early childhood education. The Bezos Day One Academies Fund. The Day One Academies Fund will launch an operating network of high-quality, full scholarship, Montessori-inspired preschools in underserved communities. The child will be the consumer, so we can bring our full consumer ethos to solving early childhood education issues. And the massive issue around social reproduction, the fact that we can't have babies, is now being solved by Amazon. So that was literally 2 days after the head tax capital strike, they announced this initiative, right? So it's not just education that they're starting to invest in. They're not want to tax. They don't want to actually be democratically accountable with what gets invested in. So it's not just these Montessori schools. This is funny, a coworker came in to work the next day and I told her, she's like, just give me the fucking money. Just pay me so I can take care of my own kid. Where was I going with this? Oh, so their other education platforms that they're investing in are largely STEM related, right? So they're investing when it comes to investing into childhood education and investing in both high school or from elementary up to college level has largely been invested in starting these computer science programs. And while, like, yes, we absolutely need people skilled in computer science, and we need to have those skills being widely distributed in our education system, it's Amazon that's deciding, hey, with our money that we've acquired, we're going to put this into the education that we want, and largely a way, if we think about it, of producing a new layer of workers that will be able to lower the cost of workers that we're already paying arm and leg for in our city, right? So they're actually choosing not just how to build our transportation system for us, not just how to solve our housing crisis for us, how to educate our kids for us, right? They're actually producing a system that's inherently really undemocratic, where they've taken all of this social wealth and all of this capital, and are essentially producing a company town, where they're essentially being like, in a very paternalistic way, we'll tell you how to raise your kids, we'll tell you how to get around the city, and we'll tell you where to live. And it's kind of affronting the fact that a corporation would believe that they not only have our right intentions at heart, that they, you know, will tell us that we're doing this for the good of society, but they're going to tell us how to live our lives. Which is capital like fully extending its domination into our lives. And so, right, if we think about this kind of paternalism, right, it comes down to essentially the fact that these companies don't pay taxes. Amazon paid $0 in federal taxes. I worked as a sortation center worker at $15,000 an hour. Or, I wish, $15,000 a year. I paid more federal taxes last year than fucking Jeff Bezos or the corporation of Amazon. Right? And so this company is all of a sudden exploiting, taking all of this wealth and deciding exactly how to invest it, right? So there's no taxation to be able to actually say, put it more under democratic control how it gets invested. But instead it systematically avoids these taxes and undemocratically decides what to do. So it's like essentially taking away any democratic participation in our lives. So it's not democratic participation in our workplace, very little democratic participation in our housing, in our transportation, in our city, in our education systems. So the last aspect that obviously is like the most frustrating, or very frustrating, is that the idea that this technology will be able to save us, right? And so if we think about monopoly capital both controls investment into the built landscape, but they also control investment in a different way. They control investment in the fact that they essentially have an interest in maintaining the relationships that exist right now for their own sustained profitability, right? So instead of investing into mass transit, into bullet trains, actually using this like engineering capacity that we have in the city, that we've developed as a society, we're largely developing these tools that serve the business interests of these large monopoly capitalists. And imagine if you're a small business that's coming out and trying to attract capital, be like, yeah, we're taking down Amazon, we're building bullet trains, and you have a venture capitalist that's sitting with a bunch of money that wants to invest. They're going to say Amazon's either going to buy you or they're going to crush you. You're not going to exist. The amount of undeveloped technology that only gets built is in relationship to the fact that they largely control how investment takes place. So yeah, and perhaps the most frustrating aspect of all of it is that instead of investing in mass transit or through taxation actually being able to put this to more democratic uses, we have one man with the audacity to build giant phalluses to be launching into space through Blue Origin with his billions of dollars, right? We're living in the fucking sixth mass extinction, and this narcissist is wanting to explore fucking Mars. Are you kidding me? So the fact that like this actually exists is mind-blowing, and it comes to the sheer fact that they control all this capital, control all this wealth. But things are changing, maybe. So if we're thinking about the working class being decomposed, we actually have some radical new changes that are happening. And one of the most interesting is actually in a place that I used to work in Minnesota in a fulfillment center. So Amazon workers there have been organizing in the workplace. And they've organized a walkout, they've organized a protest. It's been like one of the more exciting aspects that's happening in European labor organizing in a long time. But amazingly, one of the first demands that they had is a predominantly Somali workforce. Majority of these Somali workers live in the suburbs rather than in the city. But one of the first demands they had was around transportation. It was the fact that like in this one area of the city where a large amount of the Somali communities lived, they used to have a bus that served the warehouse directly. But all of a sudden they took away the bus, and it pissed a lot of people off because what used to be a 35-minute ride with the bus is now 2.5 hours by public transit. So the first demand that they actually organized around was an issue around social reproduction, right, around the city. Since then, it's actually moved into organizing around the pace of work. But another demand came out around housing. Minneapolis, like other major cities, is experiencing a huge housing crisis. And they're saying that, you're extracting all this wealth from the Somali community, invest into the Somali community, and do so by building public housing. And so this union that's starting to organize within Amazon is actually pushing, or these workers that are organizing is pushing not just around better conditions in the warehouse, but better conditions in their general life, right? And general conditions to be able to actually live more meaningful lives. And the fourth thing that they're organizing around is the right for prayer break, which is essentially, their basic rights to be a person at work, which is fundamentally denied for reasons I won't get into. But it's really exciting that you start to see this movement that's happening, or this kind of set of workers that are organizing not just around challenging the relationships at work, but challenging actually the fundamental capitalist relationship of them controlling investment in their lives and controlling and dominating their lives even outside of the workplace. And what's really interesting to see is this kind of new development happening of tech workers, right? So if you think of tech workers historically being very liberal, there's now a growing base of tech workers through a handful of organizations. One's called the Tech Workers Coalition, but strangely enough, one of the best unions organizing in the tech industry is actually 350 Seattle, which is a climate group. And tech worker class consciousness is really interesting, right? It's taking this idea of we recognize that we want to be building a better place, that we kind of have faith in the system and our corporations to actually solve these issues, but we've tried solving them the ways that have been mandated, right? We've gone to HR around sexual harassment and discrimination, and we got nowhere. We go to the environmental teams that are built to, manage the environmental future of the company and say proposals that we need to cut our emissions, and they go nowhere, right? So they've gone through the channels, and all of a sudden there's this movement that's starting to pick up within these workplaces of tech workers that are actually recognizing that they have huge amounts of power, and that they actually come together in their workplace to put pressure on their bosses directly and immediately, operating as a union, they can actually see changes. One of the really interesting ones that's happening, and I think all of them are fascinating, but one of the fascinating ones relating to this talk has been the 350 Seattle project. So it started with kind of a handful of workers that were really fed up with Amazon talking this good game around sustainability. Yet, for the most part, their entire fulfillment center network depends heavily upon fossil fuels. Amazon was the only company in the tech industry that hadn't released any data, public data around their emissions, and hadn't set any standards around carbon reduction. Walmart had. You're fucking up when Walmart's doing better than you, right? And so all of a sudden, they started to organize internally. And what they did is they started with having conversations as a group, but then they recognized that they're shareholders. And in this last week, they put on a shareholders initiative, saying that Amazon needs to release their total amount of carbon emissions data and actually set standards on how to reduce their carbon emissions over time. And what was interesting is when they first put out this petition, Amazon hadn't responded to any of this, and all of a sudden they got 8,000 signatures, in particular people that were very high up in the company, engineers. And all of a sudden, 2 weeks later, we get a release of Amazon saying that it's producing a new report that's going to say, not just release its emission data, but also try to set targets. But what's been interesting is that it got turned down in the shareholders initiative this last week. But it's been a huge organizing initiative, tech workers recognizing that they care about the climate, they care about the future of the planet, and the best way to actually change that is not necessarily to go vote for Al Gore, but instead to leverage their structural power as workers to change the company that they work at and change the industry as a whole. And so it's kind of a really interesting change of tactics around addressing these kind of latent issues, political issues that already exist within the community. But what's been really interesting about the 350 work is that, so last year when I was working in the warehouses, right, during fire season, the fires were so bad that you couldn't see the other side of the warehouse. You would go, and in my job, I worked 12 miles a day. Actually, I worked 12 miles in a 4-hour shift. And tech workers were told to go home, stay at home, have clean air. Warehouse workers, of course, were told to come in. So we were working in this environment where literally your eyes would be red, your lungs would be burning by the end of the shift. You're sitting there pushing commodities around boxes and fully rolled in this process of climate destruction while your body is literally falling apart as a result of just the smoke that's in the atmosphere. But if you actually extend outside our warehouse, earlier this year there was 2 warehouse workers that were killed in Baltimore from a hurricane. So it was a hurricane that came in that's been exacerbated by climate change that actually collapsed a warehouse and killed 2 workers. During the forest fires in LA, or in California, they sent workers home, but sent some of those workers home without pay. In Minnesota, during this last polar vortex, workers weren't able to go to work when it was 30 degrees below zero. And of course, when they were told not to come into work, they weren't paid for that week when they were away. But what's been fascinating is to see these tech workers that have been organizing around the climate and recognize all of a sudden that, like, as tech workers, they may not be exposed as much as lower income people, like largely working class people, to the consequences of climate change, and saying, hey, we want to work and make sure that you get back pay for any major climate event that happens. So you have these tech workers that never in a million years would have been talking to these warehouse workers, all of a sudden articulating a set of demands around climate justice that brings together these working class communities that essentially haven't been like in any bit of social relationship in a long time, right? Like really separated and segregated communities. And then all of a sudden there's dialogue that's happening. And that's kind of one of the more fascinating things. And I think we see this too with facial recognition technology and AI. So, right, like you have activists that are, radical anti-ICE activists, anti-deportation activists that are now talking to tech workers being like, your algorithms that you build are being used to deport my sister. And you have those activists that are coming in and building relationships with tech workers, and the tech workers, both at Microsoft and Amazon, have filed this petition and again are trying to organize internally to actually have higher standards around AI and the technologies that they're developing and not sell to ICE. And similar that's happening with the climate group. They are pushing the company not to sell the AI and the cloud computing infrastructure to oil companies, right? You can't say that you're actually for reducing our carbon footprint, but be increasing the capacities of these oil companies to be able to exploit oil as a reserve even further. If you're not taking that into account, you're not doing your fucking job. And so you have these relationships that are actually being built across tech worker groups and broader social issues that extend far beyond the warehouse. And yeah, another good example is tech workers too organizing in both here in Seattle and in the Bay Area with campus workers. So the campus workers that have been subcontracted, that don't have the same rights, that obviously don't get the stock options and benefits. They were trying to organize a union for a long time, and around Facebook they were organizing around this. And for a long period of time, Facebook was like, oh, this isn't our business, despite the fact that like you're working on our campus, you serve our food, you drive our workers. We're not touching this. This is a separate subcontracted company. It's not our issue. But all of a sudden, when the union organizers and the workers brought together and started talking to other tech workers started to show up to the negotiation meetings. All of a sudden, when Facebook workers showed up to the tech meetings, 2 weeks later, Zuckerberg makes an announcement that they're increasing the standards to $15 for all campus workers and all people that are not directly or subcontracted by Facebook. But more importantly, they actually won their union contract, and that union contract led for those Facebook cafeteria workers to be earning $24, $25 an hour. And what's crazy, what I hear here in Seattle, is that they're actually putting in the contract with the union that they're negotiating at Google. Essentially, I'm not sure legally how much I can say, but what's been happening is that we're seeing some pressure from the company around making sure that tech workers aren't allowed to actually be involved in the negotiation process or be involved in any of the union organizing work with the campus workers. But in all of these situations, right, which are like the Tech Workers Coalition and these other tech groups are actually starting to build these bridges and starting to build, a sense, a working class that is fighting for itself, that builds across these ways in which the working class have been historically separated and as I said, decomposed. So that's what I was just talking about, was all the organizing. Another fun one, last one, that's really exciting that happened recently is a group called Oneans. And Oneans are a group of mothers that work on the tech campus, and they're really pissed off at the cost of reproductive care, right? The cost of raising a kid in the city, and also the burdens of being told that the best way that you be a feminist in the workplace is to lean in and not have kids or delay having children, and then not actually having the ability to, not having socialized childcare, not having affordable childcare. So one of the demands that they said is that Amazon should be providing childcare for their workers. And of course, this is an issue that extends far beyond this group of Amazonians. And they've been, funnily enough, just coming in and nicely talking at shareholder meetings and had zero kind of militancy in their organizing. But seeing all the other organizing that's going on, these group of Amazonians all of a sudden are pissed off. And again, taking more of a unionist approach to organizing around these issues. And if we think about, right, this issue around childcare, it's an issue that is not just for these much wealthier families that work in HQ, but right? Like in the warehouses in South King County and the warehouses across the United States, childcare and child reproduction is a major issue. If you actually had any kind of organizing process that was trying to move and make demands around childcare that Amazon needs to produce and like give its wealth to something that would make us happier in terms of actually having the ability to care for our children, it's a pretty massive demand that's starting to get at these issues around how Amazon and how these companies shape our lives. Yeah, and it's not just workers that are happening in these cities that are organizing. They're capable of challenging this relationship and actually challenging this social wealth that has largely been in the hands of capital for the last 40 years and trying to, take that back to serve our needs. So I think when we look at the head tax, right, there's no clear line about how this politics has been shaping up, right? So you had a group of leftists that had built momentum after the Trump-free Seattle around the income tax that all of a sudden started to push corporations to fund services for the homeless as well as actually build affordable housing, right? And so we actually had this kind of group of smaller left organizations that were like punching way above their weight. And you had, the ability of this group to go out and make this huge demand that was initially extremely popular around actually taxing these corporations through a head tax to fund these social services. But we lost, right? So it's worth thinking about why we lost, right? And the main reason is that capital used its major weapon. As soon as there was the city council saying that they came out in favor of this, Amazon threatened a capital strike, right? They threatened their investment into the city. They're saying, we're not going to invest in your city anymore if you keep on, hurting our feelings. And so all of a sudden they had the ability through their class power, right, through class warfare to say, we're not going to actually invest in your city anymore. We're going to actually take away your jobs, take away your livelihood, take away the city that you depend upon in response for you politically challenging us, right? And so they used what we would call structural power, economic power, to be able to make that demand. And everyone remembered what happened, right? City councilors came back crying, saying, we're sorry, on our knees, let's restart this relationship. We didn't mean it. The only people that actually maintained loyal to that side was Shama, who's actually accountable to an organization, right? Accountable to constituents within her community, actually connected to an organization that can build accountability for our elected officials rather than the Democratic Party, which doesn't, or our labor institutions, which do not. But the situation is that they had huge amounts of structural power on top of this argument that, the government won't be able to actually solve these problems. Instead, we need to look for our own solutions, and that's when they had, said that we're going to do Mary's Place into our own education systems. But the left, we had strong associational power, right? We had these growing political parties. We were able to put people politically in office, but we didn't have any structural power. We didn't have any economic power to be able to say when they're striking around investing into our communities, we didn't have the ability to strike back and be like, you're not making money. Right? So we didn't have a base within Amazon that would be willing to challenge those relationships. We didn't have a base within Google. We didn't have a really strong base in labor institutions or in general the capacity to actually disrupt the economic process through withholding our labor, which produces all that wealth. Right? So we didn't have that power, and that's big, right? When it actually comes down to the ability to get at this money and the ability to actually get at this tax base, or get at this social wealth that we all produce, we need power. Right? Elected officials aren't necessarily going to get us there, and essentially Democrats definitely won't either when there's no accountability to kind of people that are electing them into office. So without the ability to actually go on strike or to fundamentally disrupt the realization of value or the production of the wealth that we all make, we ended up losing, right? We also didn't have a really strong base. Largely our activist communities are smaller groups of activists growing. But at the same time, it's not deeply rooted in our communities where we are able to have mass demonstrations. So it's a small amount of activists that are definitely punching above their weight, but we don't really have a connected base and don't have a working class that's really working for itself in that way. So if we're thinking about what it means to build strategy and think about what it means to organize to actually get the city we want, to actually organize in a way that allows us to build communities, to build meaningful lives, to actually have the kind of lives that we value and the kind of lives that aren't just built for us, but also for our larger environment that's in crisis, right? Is how do we start to organize in that way to build power? And the first is build unions, right? We have these groups that are coming out like the Tech Workers Coalition that are starting to organize the unorganized. There's, 500,000 warehouse workers in this country that don't have a union at Amazon and don't have kind of the political capacity to actually have a voice on the job, have a voice in their communities, be able to exercise the political power that a union has. And union power is also really essential in workplaces, in particular in South King County, right? In the warehouses. If we think of these warehouses that are separated so much by distance, by race, by gender, unions actually are a really interesting space, and I've seen it firsthand in my own organizing work, where all of a sudden you get a Somali mother of 45 talking to a young black man of 22 and a white, Trump supporter of 45 with a US hat on, and all of a sudden they're talking about how much they hate their boss, how much rent they're paying, their relationship to their landlord, and all of a sudden the guy makes a racist remark, and you're like, dude, you're fucking hurting Fatima. Like, this hurts people. You can't do this. You can't just be a racist fucking prick. This has consequences, not just for, not just for Fatima's feelings, but also for the ability for you to get free, for the ability for you to live the life that you want to live. So unions, in a sense, are actually quite fascinating. And Amazon warehouses are fascinating because they're taking people, right, from this really disparate community and sort of like mixing them back in together into this space where you have 2,000 workers in one plant. They're experiencing very similar things, have very similar life experiences. And if we're building the kind of unions that are actually rooted in building that kind of mass power, we really need to be focusing on how to build solidarity, right? Actually address these kind of emotional traumas that exist within most working class lives and produce the spaces to actually heal a little bit, but also heal by building real unity and real community in these workplaces and spaces. And so if we're thinking about unions, it's not just about the ability to exercise power, but also to kind of build a class for itself and kind of address the major emotional communal issues that are pretty rife within our communities. The second is dual power institutions. And by dual power, I mean the ability for the working class to be able to build spaces outside of capital, or spaces for itself. And dual power, what I mean by this is there's ways of counter institutions against capital, right? So we think of unions as the ability to challenge in a workplace, but dual power is the ability to organize in a way where you're meeting the needs of the people. So the Black Panthers are a good example of a dual power institution where their main slogan was serve the people, fight the power. And they serve breakfast, right? And they serve lunch, or serve breakfast programs. They did gardening programs, they had urban protection programs. They essentially provided a range of services as well as building militant political cadre within that community. And they built a base, right? And they actually built an institution that was meeting people's needs. They were building clinics, they were making sure people were fed. And in areas like South King County, the liberals right now are talking about the suburbs as being this spatial mismatch between NGOs and services and where poor people are actually living. And the issue is that there isn't kind of an NGO community that serves South King County or serves these suburban communities. There are real material needs that exist and aren't being met by the capitalist state or by the arms of the NGO industrial complex. And so building these kinds of institutions is a generative process of serving the people, but also thinking about building our communities outside of it. That looks like cooperatives, of where we're building our own economic institutions. That starts cooperative cafes or cooperative groceries, where it's not based on profit, but serving human need. It's about building kind of social spaces, right? Building the kind of city that actually, in relationships that make people feel good. Socialists in Europe actually were organizing, instead of just organizing unions or strikes or demonstrations, they were organizing bike rides in the countryside, and they would get 20,000 people to go on a bike ride outside of the industrial cities. They were organizing reading groups, they were organizing gymnasiums, they were organizing sporting events. They were taking all these spaces of actually producing the life that people wanted, and they were organizing that. They were organizing these relationships. They were building power within these communities. And the left has largely abandoned that as a particular strategy. We see those are NGOs or it's corporations, YMCA, which is a heavily neoliberal institution. These are the things that should be building those relationships rather than us starting these businesses, starting these organizations. And it extends beyond that, beyond just serving the people in that way, to building housing, right? We have the ability to form land trusts. We don't have anyone on the left, unfortunately, that's working on actually getting funding to build cooperative houses, to actually build housing infrastructure that when you're building that house or building that apartment complex and building density, say, in a suburban community, you're building in a community kitchen, you're building in a mental health clinic, you're building in the space for the cooperative grocery store. You're actually taking the space and taking capital outside the capitalist system of domination and producing the city for yourself, right? Producing the city for the class for itself. So if we're thinking about strategy, the left has largely neglected this element of organizing. And it really, like, for it to build and build the capacity to actually have a class that's organized, to find the real leaders that are going to be leading these strikes, to build power that actually has duration, you need to be building these kinds of institutions that have durable power. And the third is transitional demands, and this is what the left is good at, right? We're very good at having an institution like Jacobin, or having left officials that are able to raise these kind of things like the Green New Deal or Medicare for all. We don't necessarily, I believe, yet to have the power to actually win the ones that we want. But these kinds of transitional demands really do matter as a way of building kind of our political imagination and expanding what we believe to be possible. If we're thinking also about the Green New Deal and the way that we build Medicare for all, for just allowing corporations to take into those spaces and develop those in the ways that they want, rather than thinking of the Green New Deal as building housing and transportation as a means of continuing to build these dual power institutions, build our own power, and actually build our base progressively over time, then we're missing out, right? Like, if we think that capital is just going to be able to, like, solve these particular issues and we should just let businesses come in and do it, we're wrong. We should be using this as an opportunity to actually build our base durably over the long term. So if we had to think about transitional demands, absolutely, but we have to think about them as part of an integrated strategy that's connected to our union building and connected to our larger party building and organization building strategies. And so I think that there's huge potential, right, for the kind of things that we're seeing in cities right now between tenant unions in places like Philadelphia and emerging ones here in Seattle that aren't just mobilizing organizations that send, you know, a couple people to talk at City Hall and a lawyer that's going to deal with a couple complaints, but actually building organizations that are membership-based, that are, you know, fighting landlords directly around rent hikes, but also building social spaces that people get to hang out and actually have real community with each other. So these tenant unions that are growing aren't just the ones that we've thought of kind of a mobilizing approach, but rather this deep organizing. And it's the same thing, right, with our unions. If we're thinking about how to build unions, and as leftists, there should be like a primary thing that we're doing as leftists is being engaged in our workplaces in terms of building that kind of power. If we're thinking about how to build that, we should be thinking about not just depending on kind of the mobilizing strategy that exists in unions of, like, you know, using the money that's used to send mailers out for elections rather than actually building an organization that's composed of workers for workers. We need to be in those unions and building that kind of union democracy and building those kinds of spaces. And by doing that, we not only bring life to the union again, but we also can take political charge of those unions and start to use that kind of political power to address these larger demands. And a good example of this is in the city of Seattle, the Teamsters Union, which represents UPS package drivers. And when the head tax came out, the president of the union came out against the head tax. They came out against the head tax, the union did, because A, they depend on capital investment for the construction workers that are part of the union. So they're highly tied to the capital's interests, because if capital interest investment goes away, their money goes away. But also because they had the dumbest idea that by coming out on Amazon's sides, they'd be willing to negotiate a contract with the union bosses. So this guy had the fucking audacity, this union president had the audacity to believe that him being in this point of political office, that it wouldn't actually require workers organizing a base, but him being some elite representative of workers to be able to negotiate directly with Bezos to get a good deal for those workers. So it leaves workers behind and actually circumvents any of the processes of union democracy that we need. So we need to be able to take over those unions and have leftists within those unions. They're able to leverage the power of those unions, which have immense power, for these kind of political ends to actually get the kind of city that we want and get the kind of environment that actually allows the working class to thrive and build the communities that we deserve. So that's my spiel. Any questions? Comments, thoughts?
Are you writing, is this a thesis? Are you going to write a book? Or?
Yeah. Yeah, there's an opportunity to write a book, but I'm moving towards that process. When I was working, it was much harder to write publicly because I didn't want to have that identity out there. I've done some writing for The Guardian. It's called what was it called? The Amazon Diaries. But it was discontinued when I was fired for organizing. But yes, there's a plan to write.
Yeah, I have a question about maybe some strategies about arguing with people about, maybe stuff like the head tax, where Amazon really is able to frame the debate and set the everyone else that I know outside of leftist organizations was totally against the head tax in Seattle, which it seemed like it was kind of a no-brainer to me, but Amazon really kind of dominated the argument. And the other thing, on the opposite side of that, I'm wondering about this kind of reaction people have towards tech workers as well, as like kind of focusing on them as the enemy rather than on, I know that a few years ago there was a lot of activists in the city who were kind of trying to like block buses that were going to Microsoft or whatever, like if they could just stop the tech workers or something.
Right.
And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about kind of strategies around.
I think the first one is in relationship to this fact that people aren't really members of political organizations or political communities. And so ideology tends to operate much more functionally in that kind of space. So if you're not part of a political organization where you're debating political strategy, where you're talking about ideas, when you're talking about like the actual relationships that shape your life, like it's much easier to be shaped by a narrative that, we've been giving them money and they're failing to deliver because look, there's still homeless people on the streets. So we shouldn't do that because governments are a waste. Right, so I think that's a failure of our unions, a failure kind of our political organizations to actually build political consciousness. And I think, ideology functions much more smoothly in a space without that kind of organizational power. In terms of your second question, I have an issue politically with kind of the ultra-leftist stance against tech workers. I think that the understanding of tech workers as somehow being outside of capital or being purely on the side of capital, I think is wrong. I think that's like empirically true when you talk to tech workers about their jobs and their experiences for the vast majority. I think that if you're not thinking about, in particular, the power that tech workers have, right? If you want to imagine a strike of warehouse workers, right? It's really powerful. You go out, cities, don't get their stuff delivered to them. It's pretty powerful, right? Imagine Amazon.com shutting down for a day, or AWS saying, hey, no, Netflix, you don't get to use your servers. Imagine the power of that kind of strike, right? So if we're not thinking about and organizing in a way that's trying to build our power in the long run and build durable institutions that are capable of actually producing that power, then I don't have much time for that argument. But I do think that was interest in that moment. I think the argument that a lot of them do have is that it was kind of like the deed of provoking them to think about the world outside of themselves. And I don't think that argument's necessarily true either. I think it comes from people that haven't spoken much to those workers that actually do care about those things and do see those in their lives. And so the idea of we need to provoke them to actually act morally or ethically, I think is kind of Blunkist and kind of depends on a small set of radical activists that think they're the vanguardist part of the organization rather than doing the hard organizing work of meeting people where they are and building those institutions over time.
DSA has a philosophy that corporations should be state-run. So if these tech workers that are getting these huge astronomical salaries have so much talent, I should think that they would be craving to not build video games where you're shooting people all the time, or deploying things off an Amazon shop that can't even be recycled. I would think that they would be craving designing cool cities and urban planning to use their talents. So I'm just wondering, I wonder how long it would take for us to, because if it were state-owned, then those corporations, the capital, could go towards, the community and improving, when I go to a city council meeting and they're talking about a transportation thing, it's not in 3D, it's all flat. And they could make things, they could make the curriculum of schools similar to the ones you pay $20,000 a year for your kid. They could give that to the public school, but they're not, it's not. So I'm just wondering I wonder how long it's going to take for, for the corporations to be state-owned, like DSA imagines. I mean, will it be 20 years, 40 years?
I think if we separate that question out, there's really interesting things, right? There's first off the frustration of the fact that we're designing Juicero. Everyone remembers Juicero. It's like this $400 million venture-backed product that was essentially a blender, and like a poorly functioning one at that. And they were like revolutionizing the juice industry. And so I think there's a lot of tech workers that I've spoken to that are very frustrated about the fact that, like, you know, working for Amazon Alexa, instead of like addressing building new cities, they're addressing how to turn off light switches. Not that that's not important for people with disabilities or things like that, but at the same time, there is like real frustration over the limits of what can be accomplished within the system that they're in. And the challenge with that is that largely the solution is to let me start a new company and, you know, work for that new company that will actually make these things. The problem with that, again, is the structural condition is that you start that company, and if it's actually going to change things that are, you know, the basis upon which these companies are profiting, you're not going to exist for very long. And so it's just a bad strategy to achieve what is essentially the quest for more meaningful work and to actually unleash our potential to address these major social issues. But it's hard to put a timeline on when kind of that nationalization or a system that would allow us to invest into projects that would actually allow us to use this engineering talent to address social need. And I think that's something that we can't predict, but we have to start building power and building organizations to be able to take control of capital to invest it in those kinds of projects rather than the projects that capital now views as most important for its own reproduction.
Yeah, I used to look at the Green New Deal as sort of a liberal technocratic fix, but I'm really engaged by the dialogue that's going on at a very high level, I think, between Jasper Burns in Commune and Thea Riofrancos, who came here the third week in Viewpoint. Thea's approach to the Green New Deal is as a transitional demand. For her, meeting people where they're at, she says it's 70% popular in the sense that people both see it as giving jobs, which is popular, and everybody is pretty uneasy about how their climate has changed in terms of forest fires, floods, hurricanes over the last 5 years. Whatever the people, electeds are saying, they know that something's going on. So it starts by being popular, and her notion is that because our institutions can't deliver it, the demand will lead to an attempt to change institutions in order to get it. What about pressure from tech workers, getting tech workers on board on this, to get their companies to endorse the Green New Deal and to not let them down, in the sense that they probably favor it too for the same reasons. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, that seems to me a campaign that over 5 or 10 years could really have some purchase.
I think that's a great idea. We've struggled to even get our unions to endorse we've really struggled to get our unions even to endorse the Green New Deal. And I think it would be extremely interesting because it does get at this kind of contradiction between Amazon's going to solve the problem versus kind of the socialization of that issue.
Exactly. In other words, the pressure is already coming from tech workers that they have to do something for it. And if it becomes, no, it's not up to you to solve the problem, but you have to help the people whose only job is to solve the problem rather than to make a profit. Right.
I think that's a really excellent demand. It'd be really interesting to see kind of how these new tech worker groups start to articulate and relate to these socialist movements. Yeah. What's cool about Tech Workers Coalition and these other groups that are organizing is that they essentially are kind of cadre-based organizations that are leftist, kind of broader tent in terms of their political trajectories, but they are very much around like interested thinking about these. That's a strategy question, and I think a good strategy question.
I guess I have one more question too, which is about the right to the city. I saw you have a slide there, but you went through it quickly. In terms of social reproduction strikes, we have a situation now in the city, in Amazon, where about 5% of the people are doing really well, or 10, and everybody, at whatever class level, it's not part of the urban growth machine or a tech worker, is struggling in some way or another. Some people are having to move out into vans. Some people are being displaced from their houses in other neighborhoods. Elderly people who are living on fixed income suddenly find that they can't afford $27 breakfast. And essentially, you know, there's distress everywhere, and yet everybody's suffering it alone. So it seems to me that there is the possibility of coalition for groups that don't usually form coalitions around the notion of the right to stay put as a right to the city, in the sense that capital is there sweeping everybody out and saying, you know, time for you to leave, and we're bringing higher net worth individuals, and so we can make the city what we think is a world-class city.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me there's possibility for disruption and organization over time if one found a way to articulate, and the reason I say that is what seems to be happening is exactly the opposite. Tenants at the moment seem to be aligned with capital, developer capital, because they think essentially they bought into the line of trickle-down housing. The idea is if they build more supply, eventually some of it will filter down. That's one of the arguments you hear. So they're very good at the moment. There's this alliance against boomers or people who own houses, or, sort of middle and so forth, and it's working fairly well in terms of negative solidarity. But in the end, capital will make alliances with the bottom, with other people and so forth as it needs it. So the question is there some sort of larger tent organization or drive against capital that people who are in different situations, in classic different situations, can see capital as the structure of capital as their enemy, rather than these particular people in this neighborhood. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think radical tenant unions have actually been some of the best organizations that kind of lay bare that relationship. It usually happens when people take action rather than through language, right? So it's tenant unions in general in Los Angeles, Portland, Philadelphia are some of the most radical tenant unions. And they're building these larger membership organizations that have rolling rent strikes. And for people in those organizations, it's been their actual taking of direct action against landlords and working cooperatively in a group to have change that it becomes very clear the class dynamic and the class relationship. And that's usually far more powerful, right? I think we can take this from anarchists, right? That direct action both gets the goods, but it's also the main ways in which people change their perspectives and minds. And I think from those spaces, you're starting to see really interesting articulations over the right to the city. What's interesting too, it's right to the city, but also the right to move, the right to mobility more so than anything else, and the ability to choose where you live, because not all of us want to stay in one place, right? It's part of a fundamental liberation of capital that we can now travel. And so I think it's those kinds of organizations that are building direct confrontational relationships with capital, that the dynamics of the capitalist system and the relations of the capitalist system are more exposed. In terms of thinking about how that moves then to kinds of demands that could bring in homeowners or bring in people that are kind of outside the typical renting relationship to capital, that's when you start talking about building in density and affordable and beautiful cities and the whole Red Vienna argument. Right. That I think is really powerful in terms of expanding our imagination. But you need the radical class consciousness, and you need the direct action, and you need those organizations on the ground to build that understanding that to get to where we need to go, this is a prolonged people's struggle and a prolonged people's war, rather than the right ideas and a beautiful picture of a city.
So in terms of unionizing, I worked for Boeing, but I was not union, and I could see the difference of how the union workers could negotiate and how the clerical class could not negotiate. And then I transitioned to the nonprofit industrial sector. And me and my coworkers would always say, we would love to join a union, but there isn't one. So I think a lot of the workforce, at least in Seattle, is sort of spread out between those smaller organizations. Some of them profess to do good, but they treat their workers like shit. And it's there's got to be some uniting force. Just as for tenants, there's got to be some way for people who work in those conditions to unionize. In terms of, it's almost like the conditions in the Amazon warehouses are deplorable, but they have that advantage that they're all in it together. Mm-hmm. So they're kind of there's a built-in opportunity for organizing.
Right.
So how do we take the rest of us and organize us?
There's been some organizing happening within kind of homeless services and other NGOs. NGOs are actually lots of organizing happening within those spaces because the conditions are terrible. You're paid like garbage and told that you're making the world better, despite looking at your boss who's earning $250,000 and living in a plum apartment over in Madison Park. Right? That's super real, and we recognize those kinds of relationships. And I think there are some unions that represent nonprofit workers, but the issue that unions will say is that it's too hard to organize a small shop, you'll never get a contract, And that's what unions will say. But back in like the 1920s and the 1930s, it wasn't unions that organized workers, it was workers that were organizing their own unions. And what most good radicals would say is that you should organize with your coworkers and start acting like a union. So even though warehouse workers in Minnesota don't have a union that represents them, they're acting as if they are a union. They're taking actions together, they're doing walkouts as a group, they're holding protests, they're making demands on the company. And by acting like a union, which is just the power of the workers working together, they are a union. And eventually that can be crystallized into an organization with a fancy, acronym. But in general, when we're starting to build these kinds of organizations, it really starts from the idea of workers coming together and acting together along their interests. And there's different ways of learning how to organize. And I think we all need to learn how to organize our workplaces better. And there's definitely skills out there. Like DSA has a workplace organizing collective that meets every Wednesday that helps people train on how to organize their workplace. The Industrial Workers of the World, IWW, is actually building kind of a niche within the space of NGOs and these smaller shops by getting workers to start acting like a union. So the resources out there, it's just kind of new for people, in particular in sectors like the NGO industrial complex, right? It's this kind of similar to tech, where they come in, they're wanting to change the world, their conditions are really bad. They also find that their organizations aren't necessarily effective in the ways that they want them to be effective, and they don't have a say in how the organization runs and what the political priorities or the strategies are of the group. And so they're starting to like organize around these things. And beforehand, it was like, let's join an NGO company or an NGO organization. But they're starting to like change their strategies or tactics of how to like actually do the work they want to do. And that comes to the political organizing and unions. So I think that's why we're starting to see this kind of like new union movement starting to pop up. But there are resources out there, and act like a union.
So it's really heartening to hear about tech workers and class consciousness. I know I can be really guilty of that sort of myopic view of being alienated from the city as a result of, rapid increases in a very specific homogenized economy of tech. And also what I see, I work in Belltown and Ballard, and I often bike through South Lake Union, and another part of this, I guess, capital investment in like an urban area is you're really isolating that sector. They have their own restaurants that close after work. They live on these campuses. They live in apartments all together. And so in that way, like, how do you even bridge that gap to, say, like, talk to tech workers, understand, and like, but how do you even, there's so many components, and I feel like scaffolding of capital that is keeping that connection really difficult.
Yeah, that bubble's not ideological, right? Like, yeah. That space is real.
Yeah.
That is real materially produced space that separates them. Yeah, no, it literally is an ideological and material bubble. And that's super real. And it's been frustrating for, I think, a lot of movements in terms of, like, seeing tech workers, completely being apolitical to the major struggles that are affecting these large cities. But I think what's interesting now is that there are those spaces to start doing it. So the Tech Workers Coalition meets monthly, and it's open to anyone that's not a tech worker. And it's a now functioning organization that has people that will talk to you and like help you connect with it around these issues and democratically decide on political priorities. So there is now a space to start talking to a tech left. That didn't exist. And so I think that's kind of what's interesting about becoming organized and starting to build an organization, is that like we can intentionally start to build struggles. And so that would be my recommendation, is like start with those organizations, and they have relationships through work and relationships through their own experiences that can connect to those things. But yeah, as of like 10 years ago, there was no space to do that, and like you could go onto Reddit and type away and find someone maybe, but beyond that, there wasn't anything real. Yeah, Fred.
Well, your talk is really inspiring, and your research. And I was just wondering, how are we going to act like a union right now and go get a drink or
I'm down with that.
Well,
my throat is parched.
Let's first give